So today on our Seed Saving 101 series, did you call it a series?
Yeah, Saving Seeds 101, I think is what I called it.
Whatever,
Names.
we'll make sure it's titled properly. Anyways, today we're out in the garden and we're going to kind of go through a really brief sort of how we plan out what we're going to put where, just sort of some of the structural layout things that we've done in the garden to hopefully help us with seed saving.
Yeah, we're kind of going back a little bit because we touched on it, we didn't go into any detail about basically separation and isolation, which is really kind of, I guess, the foundation of all this. If you wanted to get really technical, if you didn't want to have to worry about any kind of crossing, only pick one vegetable from any given species and live in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah, basically.
And you'd be good. That's not really the reality though for most of us. So this whole series is kind of, at least this first part of the series is kind of how to work with those. Where, you know, what do you need to think about? What species, what types of vegetables do you need to think about more than others? What ones are maybe a little easier, require a little less thought, a little less isolation, that sort of thing. Why does this stuff matter? Well, it matters if you're anybody, whether you're a gardener, a homesteader, a prepper, I'm going to say that too, and you're trying to be self-sufficient and keep things going, you need to learn the practical skills required to save seeds, because it's not just as simple as grabbing seeds and hoping for the best. There are some consequences, as we will talk about in our carrot video, of if you don't follow these things, you basically will end up with something that you probably won't want to eat. Essentially, isolation, separation, those are tools in your toolkit as a gardener if one of your goals is to propagate and save the seeds of the vegetable varieties that you grow and enjoy growing. Here's the end of one of our raised bed setups, and we still have to finish this whole thing, but as you can see, we've got multiple trellises in here. And what we've actually done, and this is sort of skipping ahead to something we haven't talked about yet, but this trellis here, which is right in front of me, and this trellis back here are actually about 3.5 to 4 meters apart, which gives enough distance that we can grow two kinds of common bean here without getting into too many details and not have to think about it too much. Now, you can also see we have other trellises. We have another arch trellis here, and we have another upright here. So this gives us some flexibility as far as what we plant where, and allows us to rotate crops between the beds, so we're not growing them in the same location all the time. For example, this trellis had tomatoes on it last year, so we're not going to grow tomatoes on that trellis this year. We're going to grow something different. But we do still have to keep track or be mindful of where we put what. So although I just finished saying, for example, for beans, between this trellis and this trellis, we're technically far enough. If we plant them in this middle one, that pretty much makes these other two arch trellises unusable for that one given year.
So this year, in our thinking, as Chris just mentioned, we had our tomatoes, I'm not sure if my finger will point in here, but our tomatoes were on that center upright there last year. We had our Romas there. So because we don't plant tomatoes in the same spot each year, we're going to potentially, this is our thoughts, and we're just kind of going through garden planning and how we do it here. Arch over on that side, which Chris is pointing to, we're thinking we might do our cherry tomatoes on this year, because our cherries are indeterminate and they go quite high on the trellis. So by putting our cherries on that trellis, we can still use the two other arches for our common beans and put a different type of
bean if we want,
or a pea on that center trellis. So this is kind of where we're trying to go with this video here, is just showing you that there's a lot of planning that goes into it before we just plant, even right back to the stages where we set it up originally, because as you can see, these are permanently in. We do not take these trellises down. We do not move anything around in this garden.
That's sort of, I guess, one of the ways that we use separation within our garden beds for things that require smaller separation distances. In our sort of raised bed garden, we haven't finished it yet, but we're going to have 4 corners to it, so that everything is kind of a calculated distance away from everything else, for lack of a better way to put it, which gives us a bit of flexibility and options in kind of a static garden. Like, those trellises don't come out. Kind of going back to the purpose of this video, we never really explained what separation distances or what separation or isolation means, and it pretty much it's very simple when you're talking about seed saving, because it's the distance or separation that something needs to be from its relatives to not have them cross. That's kind of the simplest. But there are many, many, many different ways to do it. So one method is kind of like what we showed, where you figure out for things that don't have high likelihoods of crossing or have smaller separation distances, you can sort of figure out in your garden space, you know, how can I juggle things around to keep them those minimum distances. So for some of the things that we consider easy, like tomatoes and beans and even lettuce as well, that's a good option. Now, that being said, the other way to do this is isolation. And if you, in the purest form, I mean, plants have a tendency, I'm going to say it this way, to try to maximize their potential. They're very good at that, both wild plants and domestic ones. So when you're using separation distances, are you 100% guaranteed without question that they won't cross? The answer is no. There is always a chance. You're just reducing it significantly in some cases. Now, on the flip side, there are plants that those minimum separation distances are so big that your average person can't separate things that far. So a great example of kind of an intermediate plant that we haven't talked about yet is peppers. Peppers need to go, I think it's about 800 meters apart, which is quite far, and they have nice, attractive flowers. Unlike tomatoes, they're relatives. They have nice, attractive flowers that insects love. So peppers have a tendency, if they're at all close to one another, to cross. Now, there are things you can do to minimize that, but if you want to do it in the most pure fashion, the only way to do it is either A, grow one variety of pepper 800 meters from any other kind, or B, physically isolate them. And that's a part we haven't really touched on too much, and we're going to go through on some species where it's, I'm going to say, maybe a little more warranted. When we did our tomato video the other day, and this is kind of our opinion, and others may have different opinions, but tomatoes are not necessarily avid crossing vegetables, with the few exceptions as we gave in that video. So that's why we've kind of considered them easy. We didn't get into things like isolation. But if you wanted to be 100% certain that your tomato would not cross, or if you can't meet the minimum separation distance, another thing you can do is physically bag flowers. If you physically bag or physically isolate, whether you use mesh that keeps insects out, etc., especially in tomatoes, because they are self-fertile, a lot of them, you're 100% guaranteed that what you're going to get is that variety, because you're basically limiting it to only that flower or flower cluster can pollinate itself. Separation and isolation, they kind of go hand in hand, because although they're different mechanisms, you're really just trying to achieve the same goal, which is preventing unwanted crossing. So coming back to this and how we've planned out our garden a little bit, this is the one end that we've actually completed with all the trellises. But then if we come down here, we have this big bed which has our cabbages, and which I'm going to come back to in a second. And we've got another trellis over here. So of course, what's going to eventually be in this space back here is getting another raised bed. We just haven't got there yet. But of course, what you grow down here is a further distance from what's down there. So you can say it's got to be at least almost 6
meters.
Yeah, between these two. So it's just kind of being mindful of that when you're deciding where to plant something. And of course, we're showing you a bit of a static garden space with the raised beds, which is different from a tilled or in-ground garden, where you might be able to juggle things around a little bit more, depending on how your space is. Now, I'm also going to come back to these cabbages for a moment, because these are hopefully going to go to seed, and it looks to me like some of them are thinking about it. But this is another part to isolation or separation. It doesn't have to be physical separation or isolation. It can also be over time. And that's something to think about with some vegetables. Now, in our tomato example, which of course, as we're talking about our trellises, in our tomato video, we're basically talking about an annual vegetable that you're going to grow every year after year after year, and probably harvest from the fruits that you collect, because the fruit is the part you like to eat. So it makes it very simple. But these cabbages, being a biannual, you have a 2-year planning process, and there are some other things to consider, which we will go into more detail when we get into the brassica / cabbage family. When we look at time, we could have these cabbages go to seed in the spring, and hypothetically grow some broccoli in the fall to save seed from, and we've spaced those out in time, which is doing the same thing, because we probably can't meet the minimum separation distance here.
And in all
in
fairness, this
bed.
cabbage was a bit of an
experiment.
Yeah, because we left it in over winter. We weren't sure if it was even going to survive, considering we are in zone 5B.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. But I think the take-home message to this video is, because we didn't really jump into describing separation and isolation, and we haven't really got into some of the actual tools like isolation cages. We mentioned bagging flowers and that sort of thing, but a lot of that's very specific to the type of vegetable. So definitely stay tuned for more. This one is probably not as informative, but hopefully at least it gives you a glimpse of a couple different very basic things that you can do. And like I say, we will go into more detail as we go through some of the different kinds of vegetables.